Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Jerusalem Press Club for inviting me to speak this year. I was fortunate enough to speak with the club last year virtually, so it's very nice to be able to be here in person. It's also a great opportunity for me to be in the region to meet with many of my Associated Press colleagues. This is a region at AP that we are deeply committed to covering. We have 250 locations around the world at AP, but what really happens here in the Middle East, the political stories, the cultural and religious issues, the security challenges, they really are of great interest to our global audiences and have reverberations far outside of the region. As was mentioned, I became executive editor of the Associated Press in September, and before that, I spent most of my career in Washington covering the White House and politics, and I was Washington bureau chief for the 4 years of the Trump presidency. That all means that I've covered a lot of elections, though not as many as all of you, and I definitely wish you luck in covering your next election in the next few months. It also is really through these experiences covering Washington that I've spent quite a bit of time thinking about the topic of your conference today, the truth. How we defend it, how we explain it, and what our role as journalists is when the truth comes under assault. And unfortunately, that happens all too often. First, I think it would be helpful to provide some context for the unique position that the AP occupies, because I think it will also help to explain some of the decisions that we make when it comes to defending the truth. As I mentioned, the AP is a truly global news organization. We produce one news report every day for the whole world. And that means that in the US, for example, we want to reach an audience of both Democrats and Republicans. We want to reach people who live in big cities and in rural areas. We want to reach people who are well educated and those who aren't. We don't aim to produce a report every day that makes everyone happy. I think we can all agree as journalists that trying to make everyone happy is not exactly a productive goal. It's pretty much an impossible task. But I would like our audiences, regardless of their political affiliations or regardless of their backgrounds, to come away from reading or viewing our journalism feeling like we made an effort to explore all sides of an issue, to feel like we're not speaking down to them when we're trying to explain the truth or call out and highlight a disinformation campaign. And at a moment when it can feel like many elements of the media industry are pushing toward the extremes themselves or trying to cater to a specific audience from specific political backgrounds, I think it's extremely important that we at the AP maintain this mission of trying to provide fact-based journalism to as broad an audience possible from all political and cultural divides. Now, here's what I think is really important, though, to know about how we approach this challenge. When I say that we ensure that we've explored all sides of an issue or thought about all of the ways that someone might approach a debate, that does not mean that we give equal weight to all viewpoints or opinions in our coverage. We focus on the facts, and sometimes the facts are simply not up for debate. People can differ in how they feel about the facts or how they want to respond to the facts, but again, sometimes the facts are simply not up for debate. So I'll give you a few examples of how we as a news organization at the AP have made that determination. Take climate change. If we're covering a story about climate change, we don't give equal voice or really any voice to climate change deniers. The science, the facts on that issue are settled and have been for some time. Similarly, it is a fact that major COVID vaccines are safe and effective. There may be people who disagree with government mandates around vaccines or choose not to be vaccinated because of personal choice, but the science and the data on vaccines are clear, and we don't give a platform to people who dispute that without evidence. And then, of course, there's the integrity of the 2020 US presidential campaign and the prospect of future challenges to American elections. And this has certainly prompted some fierce debate within newsrooms and outside of newsrooms about how journalists cover and amplify the facts. And it's also forced a real reckoning over the consequences when we as a society cannot agree on the facts. And I think it's important to be clear, there really is no debate about what happened in the 2020 US election. Joe Biden won the election with 306 electoral college votes. That put him comfortably ahead of the 270 electoral college votes needed to win. Another fact, every state in the US certified its election results, with both Republican and Democratic officials testifying to the integrity of those results. Bill Barr, who served as Donald Trump's attorney general, said there was no widespread fraud in the election. And at AP, we did an exhaustive analysis of the vote in 6 key battleground states that Trump disputed, and we found that there were fewer than 475 examples of potential fraudulent votes. 475, a number so small that even if all of those challenges had turned out to actually be tossed out, they would have had no effect on the overall election. So why am I outlining this? Well, I'm not outlining it because of any personal political perspective. Reporting and analyzing the integrity of a presidential election is not about supporting a specific candidate. We at AP were prepared to fact check and explain the election results in exactly the same way if Trump had won and Biden had lost. Our obligation is to the facts, not to a political outcome, and that's something I take very seriously. And in some ways, as a fact-based news organization, covering the integrity of the 2020 election was actually quite easy because the facts that I outlined were so clear, and we were able to so quickly explain them in detail. It's also a situation where the evidence has only continued to grow over time. But obviously, in many other ways, amplifying the truth has not been so easy. It quickly became clear to us that the facts would be disputed at the highest levels of the US government by the sitting president himself. Of course, this wasn't wholly unexpected. As I mentioned, I served as AP's bureau chief for all 4 years of the Trump presidency. And Trump spent that presidency testing how far he could push the boundaries of the truth, testing how many people within his party, within supportive media circles would amplify his statements, even when they were not aligned with the facts. So we spent quite a bit of time, as I mentioned, preparing ahead of the election for how we would explain the results to the public if they were challenged. Now, what we didn't know, what we couldn't have been fully prepared for, is just how far the president, the former president, and his supporters might take those challenges if he lost. And certainly, we were not prepared for an insurrection on the US Capitol. But we did feel confident that we had a plan to provide facts and information to the public. And as journalists, I think that this needs to be our new reality. Whether it's an election or a war or any kind of high-profile event, really, we need to assume that there will be an effort to drive disinformation. And we need to be prepared for how we can quickly and consistently combat that disinformation. We need to assume, simply put, that the truth will be challenged and amplified by powerful forces. So how did we tackle that challenge after the US election? First, at AP, we had a very unique advantage because in addition to our news coverage of elections, we also count the vote, and we declare winners in both the presidential elections and in elections all the way down the ballot to state and local races. So that gave us this enormous amount of data and information about the election. And if I'm being honest, in past election cycles, we didn't always share all of that data with the public. Our position was that if the AP called a race, if we declared a candidate a winner, that was good enough. We're a credible news organization. We're putting our stamp of approval on a race call. That should be all the public needs to know to trust that the election was legitimate. That's how we had historically approached this. But we went into 2020 knowing that we would need to do more. So we committed to explaining our race calls in all of the major US battleground states. So when we called a state for Biden, we didn't just say that we had done it, we explained why, and we explained how. Had all the votes in the most competitive areas of the state already come in? And if we couldn't call a state, we also explained why not. So you may remember that that election took not just one day, but actually a full week, and much of the focus was on Pennsylvania. And we really committed day after day to explaining to our audiences, to our customers, why we couldn't call that race. It was really an effort to try to take some of the mystery out of our complex elections and provide real-time information and facts to counter any assertions that the race wasn't being called because of some nefarious reason. We also had to make sure that those explainers, that our fact checks weren't living in isolation. We needed to seed that reporting into every story that we did. Even if it was just a few lines about how we called the election for Biden or why there was no evidence of widespread fraud, we needed to repeat the facts over and over and over again. That's something we still do to this day. Now, I was not naive enough then, nor am I now, to believe that those efforts would convince everyone who was skeptical of the election results, or everyone who assumed that the race call had not happened yet because of fraud. When we're combating misinformation, we are combating pretty powerful forces. Sometimes it's in the form of individuals with prominent platforms. Sometimes it's technological algorithms that push disinformation to people and make it hard for the facts to seep through. And there's also human nature. We all like it when people agree with us, when the news tells us what we are predisposed to believe. It's uncomfortable to be pushed outside of our comfort zone. But even being as clear-eyed as I was about the limits of our ability to combat misinformation, I was startled by what we saw on January 6th. That some Americans would be so convinced about a lie about the election that they would lead a violent insurrection on the US Capitol. And as we continue to learn more about through the congressional hearings about the insurrection, we see just how deeply the conspiracy theories went and just how far some people, again, including some of those in powerful positions, were willing to go to overturn a free and fair election in the United States. It's simply a story I didn't think I would ever be covering. I think it's also important to note that we don't only see disinformation in the United States. The Russia-Ukraine war, for example, has been beset by disinformation, largely pushed by the Russian government. If you read any Russian media coverage about the war, it tells a very different story than the situation on the ground. And I'll give you one example. At AP, we had a truly courageous team of journalists who was working on the ground in Mariupol during the siege of the city. They were the only team of international journalists working in the city at the time. And they were the first ones to report the attack on a maternity ward. You may remember seeing the really incredible image of a pregnant woman who had been caught in the bombing being pulled out of the rubble on a stretcher. It was one of those moments early on in the war that I think really crystallized the human toll of what was happening. A few days later, our team went back to the scene and reported that that woman on the stretcher had died. How did that story look from the Russian side? Russian media and Russian government officials insisted that the news coverage was fake. They argued that the women who had been in the maternity ward, the women who were in our images, were paid actors, that the attack simply never happened. Now, of course, this was not true, and we had ample evidence to prove it. But we had a situation where the Russian ambassador to the United Nations was on the floor of the Security Council arguing that this was fake news, and we had to send journalists in the middle of a siege of Mariupol back to do more reporting to try to combat that disinformation. It's another example, though, where independent reporting is crucial to shine a spotlight on what is happening around the world. And for me, it was really a moment that actually made me a bit optimistic about the power of journalism. The Russian disinformation campaign was largely tamped down. The world sat up and noticed what was happening on the ground there, and it was because of the work of our teams there. But I also get asked this question quite a bit. Am I optimistic or am I pessimistic about the ability of journalists to combat disinformation, to amplify the truth? And if I'm being honest, there are moments when I can feel pretty pessimistic about those prospects. Sometimes the scope and the scale of the disinformation campaigns can be quite staggering, and the willingness of some people to disregard the truth can be hard to stomach. And I also think we have to be realistic that there are certainly some people who we are never going to reach. Either they don't want to be reached with the facts, they are caught up by some of these technological algorithms that prevent the facts from getting in front of them. But I fundamentally remain optimistic about the power of journalism, the power to amplify the facts, not on behalf of any personal or political agenda, but simply because I believe that we as journalists have a deep commitment to advancing the truth. So I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you, and I think I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you. Do you really believe that most of Trump's supporters believed or just they were interested that the election was stolen?
It's a great question, and I can't get into the minds of all of those supporters to say what they truly believe or what they're just saying. But I do think that we have seen in a lot of public opinion polls and just in interviews that our teams have done on the ground that there is a certain segment of the American public that does actually believe that something nefarious happened, and they have been kind of surrounded on all sides by and powerful people and supportive media of those forces who amplify that information. I also think that there is some willingness to go along with that idea just because of support for Trump. But again, I do think that there is a segment that truly believes that there was widespread fraud in that election, despite no evidence to support that.
Thank you. From your vantage point as an international news agency, you see how often news organizations are using your copy and in what kind of news beats. Can you use that to reflect whether there is a decline in expertise in journalism overall?
A decline in?
A decline in expertise, in beat reporting.
In expertise.
A decline in beat reporting all over the world.
Is there a decline in expertise in journalism? It's a great question. I feel incredibly lucky to work at a news organization filled with incredible experts. I've had a chance over the last couple of days to talk to some of our teams in the region, and not just their smarts, but really their experience, what they bring to their reporting every day, whether it's through text reporting or video reporting or photos. They are the best of the best. And what I often encourage people, to do is, it can be hard in a world where we're getting information through Twitter and Instagram and Facebook and all kinds of other platforms that I'm too old to even be on these days. It's hard to be able to judge the credibility of the outlet that you're getting the news from. And I think that we as news consumers have a bit of responsibility to say, hey, is that the Associated Press? Is that a credible news organization? Or is that, someone who's just kind of pontificating there? I think that there's a certain amount of public responsibility. I do think that overall, I think at major news organizations, we still have, quite a bit of expertise. And I hope that we maintain that, because I think that, there's no substitute for having been there, for learning, studying deeply, an issue and being able to then translate what is happening on the ground to people. So I hope that there is still value in expertise in journalism.
Thank you very much for your talk and your time. In the very beginning, you mentioned climate change as an example for a topic. Well, the data is clear, the science is clear. Could you give several examples of a topic you observe still debate is going on? Because 20 years ago, there was still debate on climate change, and the balance was also observed by journalists.
It's a really good question, and so I'll give you one, from my time covering Washington. So there was a major debate in the United States over healthcare and whether the government should provide healthcare. And there are some politicians in the U.S. that say absolutely. It is clear, the evidence is clear that countries with government-run healthcare have higher quality of life, have longer life expectancy, et cetera, et cetera. Actually, when you look into the facts, there's a bit of dispute over a lot of that. And so we as a news organization can't state for a fact it is better to have government health care. We have to really present all sides of this and say, this is actually a real point of contention, and there is evidence on both sides. To me, that's an area where you want to show both sides of the debate, because it's not a debate. It's a debate over the facts. It's not a debate over how to respond to the facts. And so we constantly sort of ask ourselves that. Is this a debate over the facts or a debate over how to respond and how we view the facts? And that's sort of the frame that I like to push a lot of this through.
To what extent do you have any control, I don't know if that's the right word, over social media, where they can just print what they want?
Sometimes I wish I had more control over social media. I have control as the executive editor of the AP. I have control over AP's social media platforms. So our Twitter account, our Facebook account, Instagram accounts, those very much fall within our news department. So I can control what our presence looks like. I can control what we amplify and what we don't. But one of the realities of social media is that it's by design quite unwieldy, something that we at the Associated Press might vet very carefully in the middle of a sensitive story to make sure that we're reflecting the nuance, even in a short tweet, to make sure that we're reflecting it as accurately as possible, can get amplified in the same way or sometimes to a lesser degree than something that somebody just tweets out on a whim or something that comes from an organization that is not as careful or fact-based as we are. And I have no control over that. And I think that does make this really hard for people. And that's why, I mentioned, I think it's really important as journalists when we are trying to amplify the facts and combat disinformation that we don't look down on people who can fall victim to some of these disinformation campaigns. Some people, yes, are sort of willingly going down the rabbit hole, but I think in a lot of cases, you have people who are just getting a lot of misinformation kind of pushed toward them, and it can be really hard to separate what is real and what is not. And so I don't want us to talk down to people and say, how stupid of you to fall into that trap. I think it can be really hard to distinguish what's happening here. I think that the platforms, the social media companies, have taken some steps to try to combat this, but it feels like they're always a few steps behind, the reality of how some of these debates play out in social media.
There are a few questions that have been sent in from our viewers abroad, so we'll just try to get them in.
Great.
If that's okay. After 4 election cycles, what is the level of interest in the United States, in the world, in Israeli politics?
Oh, it's a great question. I actually got this question a bit from our staff here as well. Personally, I remain fascinated by Israeli politics, and I think the fact that there are so many elections in rapid succession is actually part of the interest. How can this keep happening? How can you keep doing election cycle after election cycle? Why is this happening? What is behind what we're seeing now? I think one of the main questions, certainly in the United States and globally, will be, does Netanyahu come back? Is this the comeback of Bibi? So I do think that despite the fact that I'm sure here it can feel a bit exhausting to go through all of these election cycles, I do think that global interest remains pretty high.
Another one from abroad, if that's okay. How is AP preparing for President Biden's visit to Israel, and what do you predict will be the focus of his trip to the Middle East?
Yeah, so President Biden will be here on his first trip. So the way that we cover presidential visits, to Israel, the first thing I should say is they are always quite intensely followed, certainly in the United States, and I know here as well. And we're really lucky. We collaborate, both our team here in the region and our team in Washington will work together. We'll have staffers here on the ground in the coverage and staffers covering President Biden who will travel in with him. My sense is, from talking to people both on our staff and from outside, that expectations for the visit are fairly low, that there's not the expectation that Biden is going to come in with a major announcement. Certainly, no sense that he's going to try to jumpstart a peace process with the Palestinians. Obviously, the government here is in a state of transition. You have elections coming up, so the new prime minister may be fairly limited in what he's able to commit to at this point. So I think the expectations are fairly low. I do think, though, that there is kind of symbolic importance anytime an American president comes to Israel. I know American presidents, view it as something that is very important for them to do because of their domestic politics at home. So I think that, there will be probably few, maybe some, they always like to surprise us, probably few sort of major announcements, but certainly a symbolic and important trip nevertheless.
Hello, thank you very much for your time. AP is uniquely situated in the newest organization in the world, a much more factual-based organization, less columnist, stuff like that. Do you think this helps you to break through echo chamber? It's like a place where most people only have sight for their opinions.
Yeah, the question was about whether, our, as AP, our unique position in not having columnists, we have no columnists, allows us to break through the echo chamber. Look, I think the thing that I am really proud of at the AP is that, we do not traffic in opinion. It's not what we do. And I think a lot of other news organizations have started to move in that direction, and I can see why. It can be quite profitable, to be honest, to try to speak to an audience that believes what you are feeding them, that wants to hear one side of the story. And I think there's room for opinion journalism. I really do. I don't think there's anything wrong with it as long as you're open about the fact that you are an opinion journalist, or the fact that you are trying to represent, one side of an issue. But that's not for us, and I do think that it unfortunately makes us unique, but I hope, and again, I'm not naive, I've been in this business for a long time, but I do hope that there is an audience out there that wants to just get the facts, that wants to just have an understanding of why something is happening, that wants to have their perspective challenged, that wants to get a sense of what's happening in other parts of the world, or in other political parties, or on other sides of an issue. So I think it does give us a unique opportunity, and I would hope an advantage as well.
One more question from abroad, and one more question from the audience here, if that's okay. How would you describe the dynamics between the AP and the Israeli authorities following the bombing in Gaza last year?
No, it's a good question. Obviously, we were quite stunned when our office in Gaza, where we had operated for 15 years, was bombed. We right away asked Israeli officials for evidence to support their assertion that there was a Hamas presence in the office that posed an urgent threat. We continue to ask for that evidence, but we have not received it to this point. As for our relationship with Israeli officials, I would say it remains a good and productive professional working relationship. I am regularly in touch with Israeli officials in my capacity, first as bureau chief and now as executive editor. Our teams here, remain really committed to covering this story and continue to have that good working relationship. You'd have to ask the Israeli officials from their side how they feel about it, but certainly it has not lessened our commitment to telling this story accurately and fairly.
Please.
Shalom, Julie. First of all, welcome to Israel.
Thank you.
I hope that the land is speaking to you through your feet. Now, I would like, AP has a worldwide span. And, in America, in American jurisprudence, the right to due process is fundamental. Now, the social media platforms are LinkedIn, Twitter. I'm not Elon Musk, I can't buy LinkedIn, okay? So they have an incredible power, more than the government, more than the official channels. And I would like this argument to be touched, because I believe that you cannot be banned on bias. Like, they can decide if two people are going to see your content or 2,000. It's not that you pay a certain amount of money and they decide how many people are going to be exposed to your views. Do you think that there could be a supranational authority in which, for instance, if I am wrong in Israel, I can't sue them in America, I can put salt on their tail? There should be a way to defend the right of social media users to a balanced treatment.
The question was, should there be a right to defend?
There should be a right to due process. In other words, there should be an authority that can see what have I done wrong. Let the platform prove that I've done wrong. The idea is that the innocence until establishment of guilt. Like in this particular case, an anti-Semite troll provoked me on LinkedIn during the night. I responded, and I found myself banned from the network, which made a huge damage to my reputation. It took away all my content, it buried it.
Oh, is the question about a right to due process
Right,
if you're...
I'm not talking about my own personal case, I'm talking about the general case. I believe that there should be a way to defend the right of due process of social media.
I think, unfortunately, I'm probably not in the best position to answer that question as someone who doesn't run a social media platform. But as I said, sometimes I wish I had more control over the social media platforms, but it's certainly an interesting debate. One last question, okay.
Question, and questions, please, no speeches.
What role does the journalism play in these days, the democratic journalist vis-a-vis the Republican journalist concerning and relating the abortion abolition? Does it have any impact, or will it have potential impact in the near or long term?
Impact in terms of?
The influence on the world opinion, the public opinion.
Look, I fundamentally believe as journalists that our role is not to shift public opinion. I really don't. I think our job as journalists is to provide the facts, to provide people all of the information that they could have to help them make a decision, to help them form their own opinion. I think that there are opinion journalists who obviously have a different job, and obviously their job is to try to shape public opinion. But I think from my perspective as an AP journalist, and I feel this way about our whole staff, our job is not to try to sway opinion either way. I just want to make sure that we give people all of the information, the credible, fact-based, accurate information that they can possibly have in order to make their own decision on where their opinion falls. I think I'm getting the sign. Thank you very much. It was a real pleasure talking with you all today. Thank you.